Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining myself, Jade Burke, a journalist at HR Grapevine today, for an HR Grapevine and Fertifa webinar entitled Mental Health Awareness Week, the Impact of Fertility and Reproductive Health Challenges on Employees. With studies indicating that people going through a fertility journey may feel depressed or suicidal, HR teams should therefore consider exploring some of the various support available for staff going through this. And today's webinar will shine a light on this, where today's speakers will discuss the impact of fertility and reproductive health challenges on mental health and well-being, as well as how employers can support employees struggling with their emotional and mental well-being as a result of fertility issues. I am joined by Sarah Pryor, the marketing consultant at Fertifa, and Ruth Petzold, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Anchor Hanover. Petzold became Anchor Hanover's first EDI manager following 15 years in various HR roles, supporting the organisation to ensure all colleagues are supported to thrive in an inclusive work environment. Plus, Lucie McGrath, Head of Client Strategy and Proposition Development at Willis Towers Watson, will also be taking part in the webinar. Within her role, she partners with clients to help them create and deliver against health and wellbeing strategies. And lastly, Anthony Ryb, a specialist fertility counsellor, will also be joining us. Alongside his private practice, Ryb currently works in a number of fertility clinics supporting donors and people exploring the options going through or coming out of fertility treatment. And throughout the duration of the webinar, we do encourage you to use the question function to put forward any questions you may have for our speakers today, as well as taking part in the several polls we'll host throughout the webinar. So without further ado, I'd just like to hand over to you, Sarah, to continue.
Thanks, Jade, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning for this Fertifa and HR Grapevine webinar. As Jade mentioned, we're going to be talking this morning around the impact of fertility and reproductive health challenges on employees during Mental Health Awareness Week. To set the scene for everybody, I think many of us know that parenthood is one of the major transitions that we go through in adult life. And this is a major transition for both men and women. However, unfortunately for some, the unfulfilled desire for a child commonly leads to significant stress, depression and anxiety. Research by Fertility Network UK actually shows that 90% of people going through a fertility journey feel depressed and 43%, nearly half, feel suicidal. For many, this situation has really been exacerbated further by the pandemic with postponements and cancellations to fertility treatments, and that has had a serious impact on mental health. So this week, as many organisations across the UK acknowledge Mental Health Awareness Week, we're going to delve further into the topic of fertility and reproductive health challenges. Today, during our discussion, I'm really happy to be joined by Lucie, Anthony and Ruth. We're going to explore the impact of fertility and reproductive health challenges on mental health and wellbeing, and look more closely at how employers can support their employees who may be struggling with the emotional and mental wellbeing as a result of fertility issues. So thank you, Lucie, Ruth and Anthony for joining us this morning. So we're going to start our discussion this morning actually with a couple of quick polls for the audience. We want to get everybody involved just to see your views first of all. As I mentioned, I think many people who haven't had direct experience of fertility challenges, and possibly many people who haven't had indirect experience of fertility challenges, might be quite shocked at those statistics that I quoted. I know I certainly was very surprised when I saw those for the first time, that 90% of people going through a fertility journey feel depressed and 43% feel suicidal. And putting that into context a little bit, we know that 1 in 6 couples in the UK have difficulties conceiving, and every LGBT plus person needs support to start a family. So that is potentially quite a significant amount of people who are experiencing issues and mental and emotional wellbeing challenges. So before we get started on our panel discussion this morning, we wanted to get your views on a couple of quick poll questions. So Jade, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll, please. Poll number 1, first of all, we'd just like to get your views on how surprised you are at those statistics. So please select an option if you wouldn't mind. Yes, very surprised. Yes, a little surprised. No, not surprised. Or you don't know. And we'll just give you a moment to vote on that poll.
Okay, brilliant. So the results for that one, we've got 46% said yes, little surprised. 20% said yes, very surprised. 33% said no, not surprised, and 1% said don't know.
Okay, fantastic. So I think, similar to myself, that has come as quite a surprise to around 2/3 of our audience today. So with that in mind, Jade, if we could please launch poll question number 2. And that's thinking about, do you know anyone, either personally or in the workplace, who has or has had fertility and or reproductive health challenges? It's just a simple yes or no.
Okay, brilliant. So 92% said yes and 8% said no.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Jade. So again, quite significant, I think, numbers there. 92% knowing somebody who has been through some kind of fertility challenge, and then looking at that with the number of people who were surprised at the challenges that some of those people may have potentially faced. So I'd like to just, with that in mind, go over to some of our guests this morning, and perhaps just to start with Anthony. Anthony, you're a specialist fertility counsellor and therapist. I'd just like to ask, do those statistics that we've presented this morning and those quick poll questions, does that reflect, you think, the work that you see in your day-to-day practice?
Hi. Yes is the quick answer. They do. I think most people that I meet know of someone who's had some sort of fertility support or fertility issues. Sometimes it can be of support, and sometimes it can be not so supportive, because everyone's got kind of, have you thought about this? Have you done this? Can I recommend this? And they're like, well, I've thought about all that. I've done all of that. I know all of that. Please just leave me alone. So it can be, the other thing as well is that with regards to the anxiety or depression, some people come in with a history of anxiety or depression or other mental health issue as well. And this just kind of further kind of goes on top of it and makes it even worse. So some people, and they don't know then kind of what's causing more stress for them. So it's a very stressful time. The other thing just to mention is, I guess a lot of people will enter, say, a fertility clinic not appreciating how stressful actually the whole journey will be. They're hoping that being in a clinic will make it less stressful and very, very easy, but sometimes that's not the case, because things go wrong, and it's an uncertain process. So extra support can be required and helpful.
Thanks, Anthony. Ruth, I'd like to come to you next, because Anchor Hanover have recently partnered with Fertifa to offer reproductive support and education to all of your colleagues. So clearly, you're being very forward-thinking in terms of offering those types of benefits to your colleagues. Do those statistics surprise you, or do they align with what you're seeing in your workplace at the moment? Ruth, I can't hear you. Can I just check whether you're on mute?
Sorry, yes, there we go. I'd say one of the statistics surprised me and one didn't. So the fact that 90% going through fertility journey felt depressed, that didn't surprise me at all. I think, as we've seen in our poll, most people know someone who has been through this journey or has been through it themselves, and that's, my sister, a close friend, have both been through this. So it didn't surprise me the amount of individuals that feel depressed. Nearly half feeling suicidal, however, the first time I saw that did surprise me. That is a huge number of people where that depression is going to an extreme, and I think it's hugely worrying. And as an employer, as someone who works in HR, it's something we can't ignore. You know, we know that a large number of our colleagues, and Hanover has a largely female workforce, will be experiencing this kind of journey. And you know, if you know that half of those people feel suicidal, that's something that we can't ignore, and we had to look at what we could do to support them.
Yeah, and Lucie, I believe you guys at Willis Towers Watson have just conducted some research around wellbeing. Again, I'd just like to ask you a similar kind of question. Were you surprised at those statistics, or does that mirror and resonate with some of the experiences that you have when you're talking to your clients at work?
I'm not surprised, Sarah, but you know, for us, emotional well-being with our clients has been a priority focus for a reasonable length of time. But what we've seen is that really accelerate in the last 6 to 12 months. And our recent research shows that it's a top priority for 9 out of 10 organisations in the short term. So very much linked to the current situation with the COVID pandemic and what we're seeing more generally in the workforce. What I think is really interesting when we talk to clients is how unseen the issues relating to reproductive health challenges and fertility really is. People are just unaware of the suicide statistics. So when we're talking to clients about some of these stats, that's the bit that really shocks them, that 1 in 6 of their population may be on a journey that they're finding challenging, and of that population, over 40% are potentially feeling suicidal at any stage. So I think that's the bit that, because it's such a taboo subject still, you know, so it's not an employer fault. It's actually just something people won't talk about because of the potential impact on their career, you know, that they might not be supportive when they raise it at work, or actually just, why should I have to talk about challenges getting pregnant? If we were able to do this naturally, I wouldn't need to be talking in advance of being pregnant about this situation. So people don't talk about it, and it's just so unseen that I think this is why actually it's a real surprise when people start to uncover some of these stats and learn more. So yeah,
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think at Fertifa, when we talk to HR professionals, we compare the topic of fertility to some of the stigmas that were faced with mental health in the workplace perhaps a decade ago. And obviously that's moved on quite significantly now. And I suppose the fact that we're all sitting here today in Mental Health Awareness Week, talking about some of those issues is quite telling as to how that has moved on. But as you're quite right, fertility remains a very taboo subject. It's something that people don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about, and certainly at work. And I think I'd like to ask Anthony, is that something that you find from your clients when you're speaking with your clients? Is that something which they find particularly hard?
Yeah, for a lot of them, it's extremely personal, because what they'll say is somebody who's possibly trying to conceive naturally doesn't go around announcing that we had sex last night because we're looking to try and get pregnant. And to start talking about, I've got a fertility appointment because that's what we're trying to do, it kind of opens up things. The other thing when people have come to me and they've said, you know, I want to go for the promotion at work. However, if I go for that, but they know I'm having fertility treatment, will I get the job, or will I just be dismissed because they think I'm going to go and have a baby and then take maternity leave? So I kind of feel I've lost the opportunity already. And bear in mind, that's another loss for them, because they've lost the ability to potentially have a child naturally. They might have lost the ability to have a child at all. And now they've lost the ability to progress in their career. So there's lots of challenges, I think, for people. And also there's trust. Some people don't get on that well with their line managers. They might get on well with some colleagues, but some colleagues talk and they want certain people to know and certain people not to know. So it just adds to the distress and the amount that they kind of contain inside of themselves, and then they don't know where to turn with it. And yeah, it becomes pretty troubling.
And we've talked a little bit about the kind of the numbers involved, and that, you know, 1 in 6 couples in the UK may be potentially trying to start a family at any point. And you know, when you equate that across to the percentage of any business's employee population, that's potentially quite huge. I think there's a statistic that 1 in every 100 babies born in the UK today is born through fertility treatment. So you know, when you're looking at a workforce and when you're looking at the impact that that can have on a workforce with those types of challenges, I think it's possibly also interesting to think about the type of person within a workforce that this can impact, because I think it's very easy to potentially fall into the idea that this is a women's issue, but that's not quite right, is it? I mean, that it goes much further than just being a women's health issue, I would say.
If you're asking me, absolutely. I see an equal amount of men. If you walk into a fertility clinic, they'll tell you 50% of all fertility issues nowadays are male factor. And it was interesting listening about the suicide rates, because we know, suicide affects many more men than women, and often it is men that will sadly look at maybe taking their lives because they feel that deep sense of shame, guilt. And also, if it is male factor, it's still their partner potentially that has to go through fertility treatment and all the invasiveness of it. So it's, again, really worrying at so many different levels. The other thing to bear in mind that it's not just attempting to have a child. It can be somebody who naturally or through fertility treatment has had a child and sadly suffered a pregnancy loss. So a lot of my work is around supporting people through pregnancy loss, and they then feel extremely stressed and are unable then to go back into the workforce. They need to take time off the stress but feel embarrassed about it. So there's a lot wrapped up in many different situations.
Absolutely. I think we're certainly seeing that the number of companies offering fertility benefits, or at least thinking about fertility benefits now, is increasing. I think another survey actually by Willis Towers Watson identified around 2/3 of US employers with over 100 employees offered fertility benefits back in 2019. So quite commonplace across corporate America, becoming more embedded here and more considered here in the UK. I'd like to kind of move on a little bit and talk about some of the steps that we can take, because I think clearly from our discussion already this morning, we can see that this is potentially a huge issue, impacting on potentially quite a volume of employees. So I think it's really timely, and it's really nice to know that there are some really progressive employers who are taking that out to their employees and showing that support. And Ruth, you guys at Anchor Hanover being one of those, really like to hear a little bit about your experience, about what you've introduced at Anchor Hanover and why, and how that's actually helping to support some of the colleagues that may be having the issues that we're talking about today.
Yeah, that's great. So we started on this journey last year, really. I went to a finance conference to speak about my new role as diversity inclusion manager at Anchor Hanover. And following that, I got an email from a colleague who'd been at the conference asking if we'd thought about fertility as part of our inclusion strategy, and raising a couple of, I wouldn't say a couple of concerns, but making a couple of points around what her experience had been in Anchor Hanover. So to be honest, it wasn't something I had thought about until that colleague made contact with me. So I was really happy that she did get in touch. And I went on a webinar very much like this one quite soon afterwards to try and start thinking about what we could do, what we could offer. I was quite clear that I wanted it to be a holistic approach. So the webinar I'd been to was hosted by Fertifa, rather like this one. So obviously there was that benefit there, which was really fascinating, and I got in touch with them straight away to find out more about it. But I was quite clear myself that I didn't just want to fix the problem by offering a benefit and that being it. I wanted it to be part of our wider wellbeing strategy, our wider inclusion strategy. So I spoke to the colleague who had made contact with me, but also our inclusion networks, because like you mentioned, Sarah, 100% of LGBT couples who want to have a family are going to need some kind of fertility treatment. It also impacts men. There could be some disabilities that could impact on fertility. So I really wanted to reach out to all of those different network groups to make sure that we were considering all different people in what our action plan became to be. So first of all, we looked at the quick wins. One of the really basic things that the colleague pointed out to me in that very first email, which was so obvious after she did it, was where we put any information about what colleagues are entitled to regarding time off and pay, where the colleagues find that information. And at Anchor Hanover at the time, it was in our maternity policy. She made the very good point that actually for someone who is trying to start a family, having to go to the maternity policy to look for that information was quite triggering. But also, as we've mentioned, it often impacts men fertility. Why would a man go to the maternity policy to look for that information? So that was a very easy thing that we could fix very cheaply, very quickly, was to make sure that information was accessible outside of the maternity policy. The other thing that we did straight away was to work on a guide to fertility in the workplace. So what we wanted this guide to be was something that was accessible and relevant for colleagues, but also their line managers. And it outlined some basic statistics around fertility, some basic information like we've shared on this webinar. It talked about why it's important to discuss it in the workplace, why it shouldn't be taboo, and the kind of impact, some examples of the impacts that different treatments might have, to try and ensure line managers understood why it's an important conversation to have. So it talked about things like appointments needing to be quite short notice, needing to change at quite short notice, people needing to inject at very specific times of the day, so they'd need to be, with working care homes, they'd need to be off the floor at certain times to have injections, might need access to fridges to store medications, all of that kind of things, very practical examples of why it's important to consider. It also included guides to have conversations, so some suggestions, some meeting outlines for colleagues and the manager around how to approach that conversation in the first instance. We know many people going through fertility treatment might not even have told their family or closest friends, and yet they're having to have this quite personal conversation with a line manager who they may or may not have a good relationship with, like Anthony's just said. So we thought having a meeting outline with some things to consider, things to think about in advance so you can prepare yourself for that conversation was really useful. And then it also at the back also wrapped together the different benefits that were already on offer that could be relevant to the colleagues. So Fertifa is one of them. We did go ahead with one of the Fertifa packages, which supports with treatment and counselling and things like that. But it also included details of our employee assistance programme helpline. It included details about salary finance. Obviously, we haven't mentioned the financial stress that can come with fertility treatment. It's not a cheap process. It's not easily accessible on the NHS quickly, and not at all for some people. If you already have other children, you might not be able to get it on the NHS at all. So those financial benefits that we offer are also details of that in there. And the last thing that's in there was very simple things everyone can think about around thinking about banter in the workplace. So if people are bringing in new babies, encouraging colleagues to not then turn to the young person next to them and say, oh, when are you starting a family? Because you don't know what they're going through. Or if someone's just got married and coming back from honeymoon, oh, you'll be starting a family next. All of these things that people say quite naturally and quite well-meaning, but can actually be really heartbreaking for someone going through any kind of treatment. So yeah, that guide was published along with a case study, because we have found through all of our comms that people engage more if they can put a real face to that. So I was very lucky that the colleague who had approached me in the first instance had been working with us on this journey, and she was happy to share her story. And that real person, that real face, talking about their real experiences, really helped colleagues to understand and to really engage with that process. And we have seen a degree of success with it. So we've had other colleagues come forward, a male colleague has come forward and shared his story so that we can use that later on this year to demonstrate a different face of fertility treatment. And we have seen a large number of colleagues in the couple of months since this has been launched access Fertifa to start exploring what they can offer to support.
Fantastic. I mean, they sound like some really concrete first steps and changes that any organisation could potentially start to put into place. Lucie, is that your experience too when you're speaking with your clients? Do they face similar challenges, would you say, and are they looking to put into place similar programs?
Yes, very much. I would just say, what Ruth's done is really amazing, because they've taken on board feedback and put in place steps and made changes that actually haven't, once they've started, haven't been that difficult to do, but have clearly really resonated well with employees and delivered lots of value. And I think when I'm talking to clients about reproductive health strategy and starting a project in this area, kind of two of the biggest barriers are the size of the project and the budget requirements. So that's what clients always mention to me, and HR contacts are also very concerned that if they start to do something, it will almost swell demand from employees for there to be more. But I think what's really important is just doing something, no matter how small it is, just starting to make some changes and begin that journey. And the work that I do and we do is really around looking at what's the strategy. It doesn't have to include or need a big budget from an employer. And we find a lot of clients start small, work on the stakeholder engagement, start to show the value of investment and return on investment that they can generate in this area, and then build a business case to introduce a service or benefit that might require some investment to bring in. So I think there's definitely a move and change happening, Sarah, at the moment in the UK market. I think our emerging trends survey data that we published last month shows that around 40% of UK organisations are either doing something now here or planning to do something in the next 12 to 24 months. And what I would really say to HR contacts and colleagues is actually just think about doing something, because as Ruth said, just making a simple change like tweaking the maternity benefit to move the information in there somewhere else can make such a massive difference to someone who's really struggling.
Absolutely. I think that's really interesting. And I think the whole issue around the taboo nature of fertility and reproductive health is very interesting, because clearly it plays into this. It's somehow not as simple as just saying go and talk about this. And I think with previous discussions that I've had with Anthony, I think you've very much said that, in some ways it does need to be almost a very specialist support that you are giving to people who are going through this process, because it's quite specialist by its nature. But there are still small steps that you can take to start that process. I think as well, the whole idea of education and hearing from Ruth how you kind of came to include this initially, because it was somebody who came to you and said, could we do something else, is really key. And again, at Fertifa, I think that's really a big part of what Fertifa aims to do, is to educate both employees of what's available to them, but also to help the education with the employer, and also to help push that education through that channel through to the employee. I'd just like to touch on something on that with Anthony, and that's around the type of employee that potentially this impacts, and the type of client that you see. Because again, just thinking back to quite an interesting conversation that Anthony and I had in the weeks leading up to the webinar, where you said something which was really interesting about perhaps sometimes this impacts people who are perhaps more senior in the organisation and the type of impact that it can have on them. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just sharing that story, Anthony.
Yeah, I think we've heard over certainly the last 12 months in many different ways, certain things being kind of a great leveler or a great equalizer. And I think fertility, health issues, support required around that tends to be that. So I've met people from every single walk of life, and all sorts of roles within any organizations, working for themselves, working for small companies, working for themselves, working for large companies. Very interestingly, I meet a lot of HR managers and HR directors themselves who tell me how difficult it is supporting lots of people coming to them with their fertility, either maternity or fertility issues, and they themselves are going through it themselves, and it triggers lots of things for them. But yeah, you could have somebody in their 20s or 30s looking to start a family or trying to start a family, having trouble creating a family. And equally, I work with people in their 40s and even 50s, and they then feel kind of embarrassed that, if they were to come in as a single woman where they've had treatment by themselves using a donor sperm, and they're pregnant and what sort of questions, what will people start thinking, tongues wagging, all of that sort of thing. So it can become quite complicated, I guess, for I guess wherever you sit or stand within the company structure. Yeah, somebody who's looked at also the other. I remember somebody saying that I support a team of like 40 or 50 people, and everyone comes to me. I've got an open door policy, and right now, and actually this was a guy who had been diagnosed with fertility issues, and he said, I just don't have the capacity now. I'm having to close my door on people, and that's really, really tough for me. But you know, we worked through certain things together, and it was helpful for them. So yeah, it just whatever role you have in an organisation, it's there's some navigation possibly to be done.
With that in mind, Jade, I'd like to launch our third poll question, if I may, which is thinking about how aware all of our attendees today think their organisation is of the impact of fertility challenges on colleagues. Hearing from Anthony there that, you know, it can affect everybody, and hearing from Ruth and Lucie about some of the steps that can be taken, I'd just like to explore this a little bit with our attendees today.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, that's on the screen now. So the options are very aware, somewhat aware, not very aware, not at all aware, or I don't know. So I'll give you guys just a couple more seconds on that one. Okay, brilliant. So we've got 4% of you said very aware, 26% said somewhat aware, 49% not very aware, 18% not at all aware, and 4% said I don't know.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So we've talked a little bit then this morning around, you know, awareness is, I think, growing of fertility and reproductive health challenges as being quite an impact on mental health and mental well-being. We've also touched a little bit on the fact that it's not just mental health, but also physical and financial well-being as well. And we've talked about some of the steps that we can take to for an employer to start a journey. I think I'd like to take a moment to think about some of those levels of support and how, Ruth, you feel as somebody who has already started to introduce that, do you feel that this has been a genuine value add to your employees and also a genuine value add to you as an employer?
Absolutely. And I think the benefit working for Anchor Hanover and launching with Anchor Hanover is that there was already a strong focus on mental health, well-being and inclusion in the organisation anyway. So it fit, exploring fertility fit nicely in with our business strategy anyway. So it sat nicely alongside other work we were doing around mental health support and training. So yeah, it definitely fit in nicely. It didn't feel out of place, which I think made colleagues more engaged with it more. Looking at some of the statistics, like I say, we've only launched Fertifa just around a couple of months ago, and there's already been nearly 100 colleagues view the website page, and a number of them have started the conversations with the initial consultations, which we were really pleased with. You know, a large portion of our workforce don't even have access to IT on a daily basis because of the nature of their work. So for that number of people to have seen the communication and taken that first step already to find out more, it just shows that there is a need out there among our colleagues. There is a desire for this kind of support, and hopefully we'll just see those numbers grow as we communicate more and more over the coming months and highlight that support. Also, just the number of contacts I've had from colleagues since. As I say, this all started with a colleague contact, but there have been a number of the colleagues who've contacted me for more information or to share their story. people commenting on our internal social media on the stories. There's definitely a need out there, desire out there from colleagues. And for the organisation, obviously, it's still early days. I'm not going to be able to quote wonderful statistics around how it's increased retention and recruitment. But, you know, for our organisation, we see it as we are hoping to see it increase things like our colleague engagement score, where we ask about whether we as an employer value our employees' well-being. We're able to shout about this externally as part of the range of benefits we offer to work with Anchor Hanover as a point of difference from some other organisations, which will hopefully help with recruitment and attraction. You know, Fertifa have wonderful statistics around absence rates and things like that, because the more support we can offer colleagues in the workplace, the less time they're likely to need to take off sick, to have treatments at home or whatever it is they need to do. So I really do think it fits in with where we are as an organisation and what we want to do for our colleagues.
That's brilliant. I think you make a really, really important point there right at the beginning, which was, you know, you already had a strong focus on mental health support, but this wasn't necessarily an area that you'd considered until that time where you were approached to, you know, as to how you might put that into place. And then looking at that poll that we've just taken, where I think 4% of our attendees said that they felt their organisations were very aware, I'd probably imagine that a vast majority of our attendees today work for organisations where mental health is taken seriously. And I think, Lucie, the survey that you guys undertook at Willis Towers Watson really shows that to be the case. So there clearly is a little bit of a gap there, in fact, probably quite a large gap between prioritising mental health, mental well-being, and also seeing the role that fertility and reproductive health plays into that. So Lucie, I'd really like to, same question to you, I suppose. Is that something, given that gap, do you feel that this really is a benefit that can add value to those employees who may be wanting to use the service, to be educated, to see what their options are, to go on and undertake treatment, and also for the employers who you're working with to actually implement these programs?
Yes, is the short answer, and I'd really echo what Ruth said. I think there's such a benefit for employers in putting something like this in, or looking at strategy and putting support services in, because there's an impact on productivity, presenteeism, absence, recruitment, retention. So many employers at the moment are focused on their diversity and inclusion agendas, and at Willis Towers Watson we think this is a really key part of any diversion and inclusivity strategy. So, you know, it picks up on your female talent, making sure you're supporting them, you're retaining and developing them. It supports with your LGBT colleague and inclusion strategy as well, because as we've said a number of times during this session, in all likelihood they will all need some level of support regardless of the route that they take to becoming parents. So for me it's such a critical part of any strategy for an employer. And I think the other thing that we've talked about, financial, physical, emotional, we've kind of touched on the social piece, and that's really important as well for employers to bear in mind, because it's such an isolating process. You feel very excluded, you feel unseen, you're not able to talk about it openly with colleagues or with your managers for all the reasons we've talked about. So it really is a kind of area of focus for employers, picks up all of the 4 core wellbeing pillars, and I think that's really important to bear in mind, as they're so interlinked and it touches all of them.
And I guess, you know, you mentioned the isolating factor there, given that, you know, many of us have been isolated from our colleagues for the past year. Is that something that you feel is particularly important right now?
Yeah, I really do, and I think it's important more generally for emotional well-being across the employee population, and people have really been struggling with that isolation and detachment from sort of human contact generally. But I think if you are in that unfortunate niche group of people who are struggling with fertility or having reproductive challenges, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're struggling to conceive. You could have PCOS, you could have endometriosis, there are all these different areas, but you have very limited support, and work is one place that, you know, it's really difficult to talk about those issues in, and it's just really important that we start to change that and make workplaces more inclusive and places that people are able to feel supported and have those conversations.
Absolutely. I think we have some questions coming in from our audience. Jade, if perhaps we could, with 20 minutes to go, perhaps if we could start to pick up on some of those questions.
Yes, definitely. No problem. So we've got a couple coming through. This one is for Ruth. Do you have any benefits to support those around menopause?
Sorry, just checking I was off mute. Yes, so actually that was something that we launched last year. Not so much benefits from our benefits platform, but we last year started to talk around menopause. Given the makeup of our workforce, which, like I've mentioned before, is largely female, and actually in certain areas of the business largely older female. So we launched a guide very similar to the one I've just described for fertility, which, as I say, quite similar topics. So it talks about some of the stats and figures around menopause, why it should be talked about at work, the kind of impacts it could have at work, and try to draw together the different policies and benefits that we have in Anchor Hanover that could support women going through menopause. So things like flexible working. We looked at whether sanitary products are available in toilets, for example, in our offices. And similar to fertility again, we launched some case studies of women talking about the impact it had on them at work, and made sure that was a range of some older women, but also some younger women who have been through early menopause because of health conditions or treatments, things like that. To again try and highlight that this isn't just something that affects women of a certain age. It can be across the spectrum of women, and also some trans individuals as well. And I have to say that guide was one of the most commented on pieces of work that we did last year on social media. It really resonated with a large number of our colleagues. The other thing we did was it made a short video, which one of our executive directors took part in, which was people talking about their experience of menopause. And also that video included some male line managers as well, talking about how they support their colleagues in the workplace going through menopause. So it is something we looked at, and I think it's another topic which can be described as a great taboo in the workplace. I know we've just said about fertility, but I think menopause is another taboo that even women don't talk about among themselves, particularly until it becomes unavoidable. So I think it fits nicely with the wellbeing agenda in the same way fertility does.
I think importantly as well, looking at reproductive health, we have talked about fertility, but Anthony touched on pregnancy loss as well earlier. And thinking of the whole range of issues and challenges that reproductive health can cover, including menopause, is really interesting. Yeah, I think it's really great to be talking about some of those issues out in the open, changing that taboo, as we said, perhaps moving in along the spectrum, really, from, as we say, comparing it to where mental health may have been perhaps a decade ago, and bringing fertility and reproductive health out into the open and allowing people to talk about it. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Ruth. Jade, do we have another question?
We've got another one here. So someone's written in, I personally feel quite stressed being in my 30s now, and I want a family, but not having, oh, sorry, it's just moved up. Where's that gone? Sorry, another one come in just as I was reading that. Yes, so not knowing, haven't found the right partner yet, and trying to focus on her career. Are more organisations in the UK looking at options like egg freezing and support in this way? Is that something that more companies should consider perhaps as well?
Yeah, I think if you wouldn't mind, guys, if I perhaps start with that one. I think, we've just mentioned there, reproductive health is more than just fertility, and I think at Fertifa, we do look at everything across the whole range, and certainly, the egg freezing statistics are really interesting. So I think, yes, that is something which is increasing at the moment. I think the number of women who feel much more empowered to talk about it and to actually think about egg freezing, I think is really increasing massively. And I think, again, this really goes back for employers, I think, is finding perhaps a benefits provider like Fertifa who can guide you on these things, who have the experience and have the knowledge of egg freezing and sperm donation and adoption and surrogacy and IVF and all of those other things that are bound up within reproductive health and fertility journeys. Just really urge you to perhaps talk to Fertifa or somebody like Fertifa who can really help you to understand the scope and the scale of the challenge, and to how that might be offered through, how some support might be offered through to employees. That's kind of from my Fertifa perspective. I think the question was in terms of employers putting it into place. Obviously, we see that with Fertifa clients who are looking to put that into place and to offer that through to their employees and colleagues. But again, I guess, Ruth, that might be something that you could cover off, or potentially Lucy, in terms of what employers are looking to offer to their employees in this field.
I think from a broader market view, Sarah, it's not something that we commonly see with UK corporates at the moment. I think those that have US headquarters will typically be more open and have at least a policy in place on it, and some will have benefits in place. But from a UK corporate perspective, there's definitely more reticence about it. We're definitely slower to be talking about it and thinking about it. That said, we do expect that the trend will start to increase with more employers looking to do something. And I think the piece, again, that Fertifa look at, and there are other companies that do that as well, is around the education and awareness piece. Is actually helping individuals understand what happens to their fertility as they age, and when it's appropriate to think about egg freezing, and actually when it might be too late in the process to do that. So I think that's really important as well, as much as the provision is about the awareness and education piece.
Also, well, what I would say also, just to add, is if the person who's written this and anybody else is becoming anxious or overly worried about this sort of thing, you could approach your HR department or whoever's involved in policy to inquire, but that will take time, I guess, to discuss and implement. In the meantime, what you can do is make yourself an appointment either with Fertifa or with a fertility clinic, and have what they call a fertility MOT, which is a fertility checkup, where they will take various blood tests, scans, and let you know your fertility. And then which will be helpful either way. You'll know whether you really need to be concerned, or whether you've got some time that you don't have to be as concerned as you might now be feeling. So that could be something that you can do, and it's quite empowering to take control of that for yourself.
Absolutely. I think those health assessments are really key, and I think as fertility starts to be seen as less of a taboo subject, hopefully people will feel more empowered and have the means to be able to go and actually think about one of those health assessments, or a conversation with a fertility advisor. That's often one of the first steps that Fertifa, one of the first contacts that Fertifa has with employees in the workplace, is through a fertility appointment, a consultation with one of the fertility advisors, exactly who can talk through some of those issues and signpost to the right types of investigations and treatments and things, so that people can really feel empowered in that journey. Because as I mentioned, I think the number of people looking to potentially freeze eggs is growing quite quickly for a number of reasons.
We've got another question here, which is quite an interesting one. So we have a male employee that is asking to work from home due to going through IVF and the concerns of COVID. Their role is an office-based role, but what would your advice be?
Ruth, would you mind?
I was just about to ask, do you mind just repeating the question, Jade? Sorry.
Yes, sure. So we have a male employee that is asking to work from home due to going through IVF and the concerns of COVID. Their role is an office-based role. What would your advice be?
I think it would be, with my HR hat on, it would have to be managed in almost the same way as it would in any other situation. So I think it's, in the first instance, looking at the flexible working policies that are already in place, having that meeting with the colleague to understand their concerns, and understanding whether the role can be done from home. I think a lot of employees, and I include Anchor Hanover in that, historically we've said lots of roles have to be office-based. Through the course of the pandemic in the last year, I think it's become quite clear that lots of those don't need to be office-based anymore, and there can be more flexibility. So obviously I can't advise on the individual circumstances. I think it has to be a conversation with them, their line manager, doing those risk assessments, having those conversations on what isn't possible, and managing it in line with the company policies.
And I think if you have an occupational health service, then that would be a really valuable referral to make, to have an external clinical view, because if the individual is worried about COVID risk, then they can perhaps talk through what those concerns are and help you and the individual work through how they might be able to be in the office part-time, or how they can improve safety or just address some of those concerns as well. So I think that might be a really useful, if you have that tool, an occupational health service to use as well.
And what I've heard as well is that sort of thing from a lot of people speaking to me, saying, I'm really worried, after however many attempts of fertility treatment, we're now pregnant, and I'm now really worried that I'm going to be out there working and catch COVID and pass it on to my partner, and everything's, so it's a really tough, challenging situation. So I think, as Ruth and Lucie have said, is to listen to the employee, manage their concerns, and where possible, everyone come together to find a resolution that fits comfortably for everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. I was just going to say that I think, it's really heartening to hear that there is clearly a willingness out there for people to support their employees and their colleagues in a positive way, with the questions that are coming in. And I think, given that we've mentioned fertility is such a sort of specialist area, it is that taboo subject. And I think, this is really where, if there are employers out there who are thinking about how do we negotiate this, is to have a look at how the types of benefits that can be offered to employees, because I think the first step can often be around education, and that first step about talking about what education packages are available and how can they benefit employees can then lead on to all of the really practical steps that Ruth's described and Lucie's described this morning around how employers can start to put programs into place that really do make a huge difference. But just to hear those types of questions around egg freezing and around people approaching their employers and employers really wanting to do the right thing, I think is really heartening. So it's really good to hear.
I think we've got time for one more, maybe two, depending on this question. But this is quite an interesting one. I think will be good to get your thoughts on. So they're asking, what support would you give to a male employee who has suffered a pregnancy loss? We had a new starter who, within a month of starting, his wife gave birth to a stillborn. We gave him time off and, with his permission, told people he had told he was expecting. But what else could we have done?
Should I start with that? I think it's an awful situation, obviously, and I think Anthony mentioned that pregnancy loss is something that needs to be considered alongside fertility. It sounds like the right steps have been taken with regards to allowing time off and asking how he'd like to inform people. I think further than that, it would depend a little bit on what the organisation has in place with regards, are there mental health first aiders? Is there an employee assistance programme that could perhaps offer some counselling or something like that? Another thing that might be worth thinking about is, whilst time off initially is obviously really important, I think we all know bereavement hits different people at different ways and in different times. So I think there's also a degree of not assuming that when he comes back to work and a month's gone by, everything's fine again. There could be, Father's Days or the anniversary of the death, things like that, where there'll be very difficult times for the colleague. So what support you can put in place a bit more ongoing, or whether they can have additional time off at various points in the future. But certainly I think looking at any mental health or employee assistance programme support and considering the longer term needs, not just the immediate needs, would be helpful. Not sure, Anthony, from your point of view.
Sadly, I've worked with a lot of people in this exact situation. When they do return to work, often it's a phased return. So starting just a few mornings a week and then kind of building up from there. Sometimes it's a bit of a roller coaster. They might come back in, feel they're not ready, and then go back. I've heard from people that their HR department has been calling every single week to check how you're doing. And whilst it's kind of very nice to hear from them, it also feels very pressurized, because it almost feels like they're asking, when are you coming back? So again, just getting the balance right with what might come across or seem as support, but might be a bit invasive or intrusive. And lastly, the right sort of counselling. I think EAP programs are wonderful to have in place, but often they only offer a certain amount of sessions, which may not be enough, and B, it might not be the appropriate. You don't know who you're getting as a therapist. So again, getting the most appropriate support. And it could be that this person would benefit from support for both him and his partner to help them both. So just some thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think just with an eye on time, I think that may have to be our last question. And I just really wanted to quickly wrap up with a thought on everything that we've discussed this morning, which is, you know, we're here today, we're talking about this issue today because it's Mental Health Awareness Week. And I think the thought that I would take away is that there are employers clearly in the UK who are really thinking about fertility as a factor of mental health. And I think there's still some way to go before fertility and reproductive health and all of these challenges and issues that we've talked about this morning can really be brought in together to say, you know, this is something that we're going to do to really make a difference to our employees. But I think, you know, at Fertifa, our sort of overriding aim is that this is around prioritising employees as human beings who have really genuine struggles related to fertility and reproductive health that can't simply be left at the office door, even if people want to. So it's fantastic to see that so many employers are really taking this seriously and asking such, you know, such quality questions around how they can support employees. So, you know, I think we would really urge employers to continue to think about that, to seek out specialists sort of support and advice where they can, because I think we've seen from both Lucie and Ruth this morning, and from some of the points that Anthony's raised too, that employers can make a huge difference in their employees' lives by starting on this type of journey and really starting to think about how important this can be in the lives of so many of their employees. So that's my closing thought. Guys, I don't know whether each of you has a quick closing thought that you'd like to give in terms of the impacts and what people can potentially do. One perhaps quick fire closing thought from each of you would be fantastic. If we could start with Ruth.
I think I'm probably going to steal one of Lucie's quotes, if that's all right, Lucie. But I think, you know, it's important to do something rather than doing nothing. So start small. Don't feel you have to go in with a huge package with lots of financial support behind it. I think doing something is better than doing nothing. So look at what the quick wins are in your organisation, and listen to the colleagues around what they feel would be most helpful.
Lucie, would you like to build on that, or is that your thoughts?
Yeah, we've just completely stole my closing thoughts. I think for me, I would say that actually there's a huge amount of support out there for organisations amongst some of the UK's leading charities in this space, so the Fertility Network, Endometriosis UK, and I would really say actually that's a really good way of starting to get some help and support and guidance on what you can do as an employer. So I definitely encourage people who are starting to think about this to look at those resources and get some support from those organisations.
Yeah, just work on a policy that supports people and make people aware of the policy. I thought earlier about having a suggestion box, which is what Ruth kind of did. Ask your employees, because they'll be your best conduit to what will best support them. And maybe put in a quiet room if you've got the space in your organisation where people can go for some time out. Can be really beneficial.
Thank Thank you. Well, I want to say personally on behalf of Fertifa, thank you to our panellists this morning for joining us. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to Jade just to close our webinar this morning. Thank you, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. Of course, I'd like to obviously thank everyone for listening and to our speakers today for this really interesting exploration into the impact of fertility and reproductive health challenges on employees, particularly as this week marks Mental Health Awareness Week. Also, please don't forget that we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar for you to listen to shortly. And I'd just like to wish you all a great afternoon, and we look forward to welcoming you back to additional webinars in the future. Thank you.